For 7 straight days, the baby elephant Peanut lay on her side like she'd given up, except she hadn't. She drank every bottle, stayed warm, stayed alert, and watched every footstep like it mattered. Mark Reynolds checked everything. No fever, no broken bones, no pain. So why wouldn't she stand? Then one morning he knelt in the straw beneath her belly and saw something so small, so ordinary, it shouldn't have mattered, except it explained everything. Dawn spilled over the Gulf Coast Elephant Rescue Center, turning marsh mist into thin gold ribbons and softening the barbed edges of every fence. Mark Reynolds walked the nursery line with his radio muted, boots dark with dew. He'd learned the hard way that animals borrowed calm from the people near them, even when the air felt wrong and time felt expensive. In the last pen, Peanut lay on her side, like a fallen statue. No one dared move. 3 months old, small for her age, she kept her trunk curled tight against her chest, as if hugging herself. Her eyes stayed open, bright, wet, too aware, locked on the wooden slats ahead, as though she expected them to change shape at any moment. She didn't blink much, not even at flies. Mark lowered into the straw and let his shadow drift away from her face. He didn't speak first. He watched her ribs rise, counted the beat, then pressed 2 fingers behind her ear where the skin was thin, warm, steady, normal. The kind of normal that should have brought relief, but instead tightened something in his throat and made him swallow hard. 7 days, 7 dawns, each morning the same. Peanut drank her bottle with stubborn strength, tugging like she meant to live forever, then eased back down and stayed there. No fever, no swelling, no limp, because she wouldn't even try. The other calves shuffled and chirped nearby, bumping rails, and Peanut only listened, silent as a secret nobody could open. He traced her legs the way he'd once checked trapped dogs after. Hurricanes. Slow hands, soft pressure, searching for the smallest flinch. Her joints flexed without protest. When he tapped a tendon, she responded instantly, not in pain, but in sharp awareness, as if she understood every test and still refused the answer he wanted. Even her tail stayed still. Across the yard, a staff cart rattled over boards, then stopped. Peanut's ear snapped toward the sound like a switch had flipped. Her gaze followed the gate, the latch, the person behind it. It wasn't panic. It was calculation, measuring distance and timing, like she was practicing an escape she didn't dare attempt in daylight. Mark felt watched right back. Before this job, Mark had pulled strangers from smoke and broken glass. He knew how trauma lived in the body, the way breathing stayed shallow long after the fire was out, the way eyes kept scanning for danger that wasn't there. Watching Peanut, he felt that old helpless heat climb his chest because she looked safe, but acted hunted. That mismatch terrified him. On day 1, he'd told the team she was exhausted. On day 3, he blamed soreness from catching up on nutrition. By day 7, the word he couldn't shake was danger. Not because she was dying, but because she wasn't moving. A calf needed to stand, to build muscle, to learn the world. Stillness could steal her future quietly, without a single alarm. A faint rasp slipped through the straw under her belly, soft, almost nothing, like plastic brushing dry grass. Mark froze, mid-breath. Peanut went rigid, eyes widening by a hair, and the air around them felt suddenly thin. He leaned closer without touching her, searching the bedding for the source, afraid of spooking whatever kept her pinned. The rasp came again, then stopped. "Any change?" called Lena Park from outside the pen, the overnight tech with a clipboard and a coffee gone cold. Mark lifted one hand, palm out, asking for quiet. Lena's voice dropped anyway, instinctively. Even the smallest sound seemed to make Peanut's skin tighten, as if her body expected the world to punish movement. Lena stepped back, like she'd crossed a line. Mark whispered the facts. 7 days down. Perfect vitals. No injury anyone could find. Lena stared at the calf, unsettled by the contradiction. "She eats like nothing's wrong," she said. "That's what scares me," Mark answered, "because a hungry animal who won't stand feels like someone holding their breath underwater." He hated that his mind kept counting hours. not days. When Lena stepped away, her boots sounded too loud on the boards. Peanut tracked her until the gate latched, then released a tiny rumble that vibrated against Mark's wrist. Less comfort than restraint. Mark slid his hand into the straw near her flank and felt something slick, foreign, hidden deep. He didn't pull it free. Not yet. Not with Peanut watching. At the fence, a teenage volunteer named Eli Brooks lingered with a broom, pretending to work. Mark caught the kid's worried stare and gave the smallest nod, a promise without words. The nursery kept breathing around them. Birds, engines, the shuffle of calves, while Peanut lay still, listening. Mark stood slowly, leaving his handprint in the straw, like a vow to return before the light changed. The next morning came in quieter, like the marsh was holding its breath. Mark arrived before the first feeding run and found Peanut in the same place, eyes open, trunk tucked, straw flattened around her ribs. He stood outside the rail a long moment, letting his presence land softly, the way you approach a skittish truth that might bolt in the dark. Dr. Nina Harper rolled in just after sunrise with a hard case of instruments and a calm that never rushed. She wasn't the kind of vet who dramatized. She listened, she watched, she waited for the animal to tell her what the charts couldn't. Mark briefed her in low tones, keeping his shoulders loose so Peanut wouldn't feel cornered, chased, or studied. Nina checked pulse points, pupils, reflexes, the subtle give of joints. She ran her fingers along Peanut's spine like reading Braille, then pressed an ear to the calf's side and counted breaths with her eyes closed. Peanut accepted every touch, even leaned into it, but made no move to rise. That quiet refusal sat heavier than any injury Mark had ever carried. Outside the pen, Lena and Eli kept the nursery moving, bottles warming, towels folded, gates latched. Mark caught Eli watching Peanut the way people watch a storm from a porch, half fear, half hope. The kid's broom paused whenever Peanut's ear twitched, like he expected her to stand up the second nobody's eyes were on her, then fall again without a sound. Nina ordered quick labs and a portable scan, then waited with Mark in the shade of the feed shed. The center's generators hummed, and somewhere a pelican slapped down on the canal with a hollow splash. Mark stared at his hands, remembering how steady they used to feel on a fire line, and how useless they felt now when the danger wouldn't show itself. The results came back clean. No infection, no fracture, no neurological red flags. Nina didn't smile. She just nodded once, like a door had closed and another had cracked open. Her body can do it, she said, so we have to ask what her mind is protecting her from. Mark felt the words land like cold rain, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't been thinking it too. Then Jade Collins showed up in crisp boots that never touched mud, phone already lit in her palm. She didn't step into the pen. She stayed at the threshold, where business stayed clean. I just got off with the main donor, she said, voice polite but tight. They're visiting, soon. They want progress they can see, with their own eyes, up close today. Mark tried to keep his tone even. He explained the risks, muscle wasting, stiff joints, the long shadow that immobility cast over a calf's future. Jade listened, but her eyes kept flicking to the schedule on her screen. I'm not the enemy, she said. I'm the reason this place keeps its doors open. The sentence was true, and it stung like salt in a cut. Midday heat pressed down, and the nursery smelled of milk replacer and sun-baked straw. Peanut drank her bottle like she was starving for tomorrow, then settled back with a soft rumble that sounded almost grateful. Mark's throat tightened at the unfairness of it. Strength without movement, life without the courage to stand. He hated that he caught himself bargaining. Just one attempt, just 1 inch. Nina watched Peanut's eyes more than her legs. Every time someone shifted weight, Peanut tracked it. Every time a latch clicked, her ear snapped toward the sound, fast as a reflex in a soldier. Nina leaned close to Mark. This isn't pain, she murmured. This is vigilance. She's measuring the room. Mark looked back and felt Peanut, measuring him too, deciding if he was safe. A radio call crackled from the front office. Another rescue request, another animal in trouble, another pull on resources running thin. Mark answered automatically, then muted it, guilt rising fast. He couldn't leave Peanut, but he couldn't stop the world from asking. That pressure squeezed his chest until breathing felt like work, and he remembered how fires used to roar loud enough to drown doubt. Late afternoon, Lena stepped into the pen and Peanut's gaze locked onto her boots. Lena froze, then backed away slowly, like she'd stepped on glass. Peanut's shoulders trembled once, tiny and quick, then went still. Flat, quiet, gone. Mark saw it clearly now. She wasn't refusing to stand out of weakness. She was rehearsing how to disappear, the way prey survives when it can't run. As the light softened, Mark sat by the rail with Nina and didn't speak for a while. The marsh wind cooled the sweat on his neck and the nurseries, quieted into evening routines, distant calls, and gentle shuffling. Nina finally said, "If we push her, we may prove her fear right." Mark nodded, and in that small agreement, he felt a new plan taking shape, slower, stranger, built on patience over force. That night, the center settled into its after-hours quiet, the kind that made every small sound feel louder than it should. Mark stayed late anyway, walking the perimeter once, then returning to Peanut's pen, as if his feet knew the way better than his mind. The calves drowsed in their stalls, and the marsh outside sighed with insects and distant water. Nina had left a note taped to the feed shed door. "Watch the patterns. Don't force contact." Mark read it twice, then folded it into his pocket like a reminder he could feel. He'd spent years believing action saved lives. Now he was being asked to save one by doing less, by becoming smaller, by not turning urgency into noise. In the office trailer, he pulled the original intake file and spread it across the desk under a weak lamp. Photos, timestamps, a short field report, and one grainy image that made his stomach turn. Peanut lying in mud beside a shadow that used to be her mother. The scene was miles inland, near a private hunting tract where fences cut the land like scars. The report said illegal snare remnants and possible vehicle tracks. It said the mother went down fast and the calf stayed. It also said the rescue team arrived to find Peanut too weak to stand, too dehydrated to cry, eyes open anyway. Mark remembered lifting her into the truck, her trunk sliding over his forearm as if she was trying to hold on to anything that felt steady. He hadn't told anyone the part that kept replaying: the sound. Back then, there had been a faint rustle near the brush line, plastic or netting moving, something that didn't belong in the woods. Mark had turned, expecting a ranger, but seen only still trees. Peanut's ear had snapped toward it, the same sharp motion he'd noticed in the pen today. Eli Brooks knocked softly and stepped into the doorway, holding a broom like a shield. He looked young enough to be anyone's grandson, with a careful way of moving that made Mark think of people trying not to startle themselves. "I can finish the night sweep," Eli offered, but he didn't leave, like he'd come for more than chores. Mark waved him in and slid the file aside. Eli glanced at the photo and swallowed hard. "She's been alone like that," he said, and his voice dipped on the last word. Mark nodded once. Eli hesitated, then admitted, "After my crash, I couldn't sit in a car with the engine running. The sound made my chest lock up. People thought it was stubbornness. It wasn't." The confession hung in the air, quiet and blunt. Mark hadn't asked, but he didn't shut it down either. He'd seen enough trauma in human eyes to recognize it in a kid's. Eli's hands tightened on the broom handle, knuckles pale, as if he was bracing for a memory to hit. "She watches the door," Eli added, "like she's waiting for the bad part." Just before midnight, Mark and Eli walked back to the nursery without talking much. They kept their steps slow, their voices lower than usual, treating the building like a church, with one fragile prayer inside. Peanut lay as she always did, but her eyes followed them as soon as the latch clicked. Mark didn't go in. He stayed outside the rail and let her see he wasn't advancing. Eli leaned close and whispered, almost to himself, "She's not asleep. She's holding still." Mark felt something shift in his thinking, like a lock turning. On a fire scene, some people ran, some froze, Some went quiet and small because quiet had kept them alive before. Peanut's stillness suddenly looked less like failure and more like strategy. Around 2:30, the nursery quieted deeper, and the moonlight turned the straw into pale waves. Mark sat on an overturned bucket with his hands folded, watching without staring. Eli hovered near the feed shed, pretending to check supplies, careful not to face Peanut directly. The center felt suspended, waiting for a move nobody could demand. At 2:48 a.m., a tiny change flickered through Peanut's body. Her shoulder lifted, then settled, then lifted again. Mark's breath caught, but he kept his face neutral, afraid even his hope could feel like pressure. Peanut tested her front legs, pushing just enough to raise her chest off the bedding. For a few seconds she held herself there, trembling, alive with effort. Then a distant door somewhere in the complex clicked, just one careless sound in the dark. Peanut dropped instantly, as if the air had snapped her back to the ground. Her trunk curled tight, and her eyes widened, scanning for the source. Mark didn't move. Eli didn't move. The only thing that moved was the fear returning, quick and efficient. When the moment passed, Mark stood and backed away like he was leaving a wild animal alone with its dignity. He didn't celebrate. He didn't reach for her. He just nodded once to Eli, a silent acknowledgement that they'd seen something real. And as the night folded back into stillness, Mark felt both heartbreak and relief, because Peanut could rise, but only when she believed no one was watching. Morning came with the ordinary noises Mark used to trust: bottles clinking, gates swinging, a radio murmuring weather, and road closures. He wished routine could solve this, the way it sometimes soothed frightened animals by pretending nothing had changed. Peanut still lay pressed into the straw, eyes tracking every shift in the aisle like she was counting exits. Mark met Nina by the feed shed and told her what he and Eli had seen after midnight. He kept his voice low, like the story might break if spoken too loudly. Nina didn't look surprised. She looked focused, as if a blurry picture had finally sharpened. "Then we document it," she said, already reaching for her phone to call in equipment. By noon, the center had borrowed 2 infrared trail cams from a nearby wildlife lab and a motion sensor kit meant for tracking nocturnal predators. It felt strange, turning rescue work into surveillance, but Mark understood the value of proof. If Peanut's body could rise in the dark, they needed to know what pulled her back down in the light and what she was listening for. He asked Lena to adjust the night rounds so doors wouldn't slam and boots wouldn't scrape boards. He asked Eli to keep volunteers away from the nursery after dusk. No curious whispers, no just checking. Mark hated making rules that sounded like superstition, but Nina's note echoed in his pocket. Watch the patterns. Don't force contact. That afternoon, Jade stepped into the walkway, with her phone held up like a badge. "I'm getting questions," she said, scanning the pen as if the answer might be visible from 5 feet away. "The donor's assistant wants a timeline. They want to see her standing before they get on a plane." Mark felt the old firefighter in him flare, protective, blunt, tired of politics. Nina joined them and kept the conversation from becoming a fight. She explained it in plain language. Peanut wasn't failing physically. She was reacting to fear. Fear didn't bend to deadlines. Jade's jaw tightened anyway. "Fear doesn't pay for formula," she replied. "Not cruel, just hard." Mark watched Peanut's eyes flick to Jade's voice and wondered if pressure had its own scent. After dinner, Mark stayed on site with Nina and Eli, all of them moving like guests in a house that belonged to someone else. They positioned the cameras high, out of reach, and tested the sensors with slow, careful steps. Peanut watched the whole time, alert but still, as if she understood she was being measured and didn't like it. Mark refused to meet her stare too long. Near midnight, the center quieted into that deep, rural silence, where even distant highway traffic sounded like a rumor. Mark sat, with a tablet balanced on his knee, watching the live feed without letting his face lean toward the screen. Nina sat beside him, arms folded, her eyes on the data more than the animal. Eli paced softly, stopping whenever a calf shifted. At 2:42 a.m., Peanut moved. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow gathering of herself, like a wave pulling back before it breaks. She tucked her front legs under her chest and pushed, trembling, rising into a half-sit. Mark's heartbeat went loud in his ears, and he fought the urge to stand up and rush in, as if speed could help courage exist. For a few seconds she held it, shoulders shaking with effort, and then she tried more. Her front end lifted higher, weight settling briefly onto her legs. It was the first time the screen showed her not flattened to the ground, not rehearsing disappearance. Nina's breath caught once, small and human. Then she went still. Afraid sound could become a warning. A gull cried outside, sharp and sudden, and somewhere in the complex a latch clicked. Just a minor noise, the kind nobody would remember. Peanut collapsed as if someone had cut a thread inside her. She didn't stumble. She dropped with intention, trunk curling tight, eyes wide and scanning. Mark felt anger rise, not at Peanut, but at the invisible trap that lived in sound. They rewound the footage again and again, looking for what changed in the moment she fell. Nina tracked timestamps and decibel spikes. Mark watched Peanut's body, the way fear traveled through her like electricity. Eli leaned closer to the screen and pointed to the bedding. "Right there," he whispered. Under her. A dark flicker, a tiny tug in the straw, like something catching. At dawn, the three of them stood at the rail while Peanut drank her bottle like nothing had happened. Mark didn't mention the cameras. He didn't mention the night. He simply watched the straw beneath her belly, now unable to ignore the faint, slick impression he'd felt with his fingers before. Whatever lived under there was small, hidden, and powerful enough to keep an elephant from standing. Jade returned later with fresh messages and a tighter schedule, but Mark barely heard her. His mind stayed on that brief lift in the dark, on the way Peanut had risen when the world felt empty, then folded herself down at a single sound. He left the nursery with a plan forming like a bruise, slow, painful, certain. The answer wasn't in her legs. It was in what she believed waited beneath her. The morning after the camera footage, Mark arrived before the sun cleared the pines, when the nursery still smelled cool and damp. Peanut lay where she always did, as if the night hadn't happened. Mark didn't challenge her with hope. He moved like a man trying not to knock over something fragile he couldn't see. He kept Nina's words in his head, "Don't force contact," and added his own rule, "Don't make her feel watched." So he busied himself with small chores, tightening a hinge, replacing a cracked bucket, sweeping the aisle with slow strokes. From the corner of his eye, Peanut tracked him anyway, calm on the outside, tense underneath. Lena offered to help him roll Peanut to fresh bedding, but Mark shook his head. The less they handled her, the better. He could feel the whole building leaning toward the mystery now, staff walking softer, talking lower. Even the other calves seemed quieter, as if they knew attention could become a kind of weight. Eli hovered near the gate with a towel over his shoulder, careful not to stare. "She moved again last night," he said, voice barely above the hum of the milk warmer. Mark nodded once, not trusting his own expression. The image of Peanut lifting into that half-sit still pinched his chest, equal parts miracle and warning. Mark waited until the nursery settled into a lull. No carts, rattling, no radios, no visitors. Then he stepped into Peanut's pen with his shoulders turned slightly away, pretending his focus was the fence line. He knelt in the straw, not beside her face, but near her belly, where the cameras had shown that faint tug. Up close, the bedding looked ordinary, dry straw, bits of hay, a few crushed leaves tracked in from boots. Mark raked his fingers slowly through it and felt something slick, not plant or dirt, a thin edge that didn't belong. He stopped, hands still, listening. Peanut's ear flicked once, sharp as a blade, but she didn't flinch away. He tested the bedding again with 2 fingers, almost like he was checking for a nail in a floorboard. The slick edge shifted, and a tiny rasp answered, soft, plastic on straw. Peanut's eyes widened a fraction, and her breathing changed, quick and shallow. Mark froze, heart hammering, realizing the sound itself was a tripwire. Nina appeared at the rail without speaking, reading Mark's posture. Like a diagnosis. Mark lifted his eyes to her, only long enough to warn her back with a single look. She stayed still. Outside, Lena and Eli stopped moving. The entire nursery suddenly held in a hush that felt deliberate, like everyone was trying to keep the world from cracking. Mark slid his hand deeper, careful not to pull fast. He found it, black nylon, crumpled and wedged under the straw, tangled with a length of clear fishing line that glinted when it caught the light. It wasn't wrapped around Peanut, not a trap on her body. It was worse in a different way. It was under her, hiding, waiting to sing its thin, familiar song. A memory hit him without invitation. The field report photo, the mud, the brush line, that faint rustle near the trees. Peanut's ear snapped toward Mark's hand again, and her whole body went rigid, like she was bracing for impact. Mark understood in a rush. Every time she tried to push up, the nylon dragged, the line tightened, and the sound whispered. The past back into her skin. He dared one gentle tug to free it, just inches, and the nylon rasped louder than before. Peanut jolted and let out a short, strangled rumble. Not a cry, but a warning. Her eyes locked on Mark, not accusing, pleading, as if she was saying, "Don't make it happen again." Mark's throat burned. He released the nylon immediately and sat back, palms open. Nina stepped into the pen with the slow patience of someone approaching a frightened child. She crouched near Mark, never reaching for Peanut, only watching the calf's breathing settle in shallow waves. "It's a trigger," she whispered, "not an injury." Mark nodded, unable to speak, because the smallest piece of trash had become a gate to a nightmare. They didn't remove it right away. Not then. Nina suggested they wait for the calmest window, when Peanut was most steady, and when they could control every sound. Mark hated waiting, but he hated the idea of proving Peanut's fear right even more. He backed out of the pen like a guest leaving quietly, trying not to take safety with him. That evening, Mark stood outside the nursery as the sky turned the marsh purple and the air cooled. Jade's texts stacked up on his phone, deadlines and questions he couldn't answer yet. He didn't reply. He watched Peanut's silhouette in the dim light, still and listening, and he made himself a promise that felt like a prayer. He would pull that nylon out, without letting it hurt her twice. The next day began with deliberate quiet, like the whole center had agreed to speak in softer versions of itself. Mark taped a simple note on the nursery door. No radios, no slamming gates. Then stepped inside with his shoulders lowered. Peanut lay in the same hollow of straw, watching him with the steady focus of someone waiting for the bad sound. Dr. Nina Harper arrived with a canvas bag instead of a hard case. Inside were clean gloves, a roll of felt, rubber mats, and a small handheld vacuum, meant for labs, not barns. "Today we change the ground," she said, calm but firm. "And we change what she thinks we are." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the plan settle onto him. They cleared the aisle first. No carts, no clinking bottles, no extra boots. Lena moved the other calves to the far side of the building so their shuffles wouldn't echo. Eli took position by the breaker panel and shut off anything that hummed or clicked. The place felt unnaturally still, as if silence itself was a tool they'd borrowed and couldn't afford to waste. Mark entered Peanut's pen, the way he'd learned to enter burn zones. Slow, purposeful, never sudden. He turned his body slightly away from her face, pretending his attention belonged to the fence post he needed to inspect. Peanut's ear flicked once, then settled. Nina stayed behind him, breathing slow, hands visible, making herself smaller than the moment. They waited through one full bottle feeding before touching anything. Peanut drank with stubborn strength, eyes never leaving the space behind Mark's shoulder. When her breathing finally softened, Nina signaled. Mark slid his hand into the straw and found the black nylon again, the fishing line tangled like a thin vein. He didn't pull. He pinned it gently, stopping it from rasping. Nina worked the straw away a handful at a time, collecting it into a bin lined with cloth so it wouldn't crinkle. Every move was slow enough to feel ridiculous, but Mark understood the math. One sharp sound could cost them days. Peanut's eyes widened whenever a strand shifted, yet she didn't bolt. She couldn't. She simply held herself still, like stillness had once saved her. When the nylon finally came free, Nina wrapped it in the felt and sealed it inside a pouch as if it were evidence. Mark felt a strange anger at the smallness of it. A piece of garbage, a few feet of line, and an elephant calf had decided the safest way to live was to play dead. He kept his face flat, afraid any emotion might read as threat. Then Jade's phone rang in the hallway, bright, sharp, impossible to ignore. Peanut flinched so hard her whole body tightened, and her trunk curled tight under her chin. Mark's stomach dropped. Jade silenced it quickly, but the damage was done. Peanut's eyes went wide and distant, scanning the door, the latch, the air. Mark wanted to shout, but he didn't dare add noise to fear. Jade stepped in anyway, whispering like a person trying to be kind while standing on a deadline. "They're coming tomorrow," she said, and Mark heard the word tomorrow like a threat. Nina held up a hand without turning. "Not in here," she murmured. Jade backed out, but Mark could feel the pressure she left behind, heavy as heat. By late afternoon, the pen looked different. Rubber mats under fresh, quiet bedding, corners padded, anything that could scrape or crinkle removed. Nina called it invisible care, and she meant it literally. Feeding stations were set so bottles could be placed without hovering. Cleaning was done while facing away. No leaning over Peanut, no wide eyes, no pity staring. Eli became essential in ways nobody had expected. He moved through the nursery like a shadow with a broom, never locking eyes, never rushing to check if Peanut noticed him. When Mark asked how he knew what to do, Eli answered simply, "People heal faster when you don't make them perform it." Mark felt that sentence hit somewhere old in his chest. As evening cooled the building, Mark took a position near Peanut's pen and began fixing a loose board 30 feet away. He made the work real, measured, drilled, tightened, so his presence had a reason that wasn't her. He kept his back turned, hands busy, jaw clenched. In the corner of his vision, Peanut lifted her head and tested her front legs, trembling. For a moment she didn't move. Then she did, slow, cautious, almost offended by her own hope. She pushed herself into a half-sit, held it for 2 full breaths, then eased back down without panicking. Mark didn't turn around. Nina didn't clap. Eli didn't whisper. They let the victory stay small enough to feel safe. Night settled in gentle and warm. Mark shut the nursery lights to a low glow and stepped outside into the marsh air, where crickets kept time like a steady heartbeat. Behind him, Peanut lay quiet, but not defeated. Mark stood with his hands on the fence rail, breathing slow, and for the first time in days, the silence felt like something healing. Morning came gentle, with a thin veil of fog drifting off the canal and settling against the nursery windows. Mark kept his footsteps slow, almost ceremonial, as if the floor could remember every hurried day that had frightened an animal. Peanut lay on the new mats, eyes open, but her breathing looked less sharp than yesterday, like she'd slept without bracing. Dr. Nina Harper met him at the door with a small speaker in her hand and a look that said she'd been thinking all night. "We can't just remove the trigger," she murmured. "We have to teach her it's over." Mark watched Peanut's ear tilt toward their voices, then settle. He nodded once, feeling the strange weight of hope, heavy because it could drop. Jade's message buzzed on Mark's phone before he could silence it. "Donor plane lands tomorrow. They want to see her stand." He didn't reply. He slid the phone into his pocket and kept his face neutral. Deadlines belonged to people. Peanut belonged to fear and memory, and fear didn't care about calendars or funding, only whether the room felt safe. They planned the day like a quiet operation. Lena moved all clinking supplies out of the nursery. Eli taped felt over a rattling latch and padded the hinges with cloth. Mark took down a poster board from the hall and set it near Peanut's pen, a makeshift shield to block direct sightlines. No one called it a stage, but it felt like one. Nina explained the no eyes rule in plain terms. When Peanut tried to rise, nobody would lean in, nobody would gasp, nobody would whisper. They would behave as if standing was ordinary, as if her effort didn't carry a month of terror. Mark understood how unnatural that was for humans, especially when you want to cheer. Still, he'd learned restraint could be mercy. Just before noon, Nina tested her speaker at the far end of the building, playing a barely there rustle, softer than wind through dry grass. Peanut didn't move at first. Then her ear flicked, and her trunk tightened against her chest. Mark felt his own muscles tense in sympathy, and forced himself to breathe slower, the way Eli had taught him without meaning to. Eli volunteered to be the closest body in the room. He stood at an angle, eyes on the floor, hands busy folding towels, as if he had no time for miracles. Mark watched the kid's posture, open, unthreatening, almost absent, and saw how useful it was. Eli wasn't trying to prove anything. He was offering space, the way he wished someone had for him. The first attempt came quietly. Peanut lifted her head, then tested her front legs against the mat, pushing just enough to raise her chest. Mark stayed by the fence, back turned, pretending to check a loose screw. In his peripheral vision, he saw her tremble, stop, then push again. She held a half-sit longer than yesterday, 3 breaths, then 4, before easing down. Nina didn't increase the rustle sound right away. She let the room rest. She spoke softly to Mark about progress being measured in seconds, not headlines. Mark wanted to argue with time, to bargain for a faster ending, but he knew better. If they rushed her, they'd teach her that standing invited pressure, exactly what her mind was trying to avoid. Mid-afternoon, a new voice appeared at the doorway. An older man in a clean polo with a visitor badge. The donor's liaison sent ahead. He introduced himself as Tom Weller, and smiled too brightly, the way people do when they're nervous around suffering. Jade trailed behind him, eyes sharp with worry. Mark stepped forward and held up a hand, stopping them before their curiosity walked in. Tom lowered his voice. "We just want to help," he said. Mark nodded, then set one boundary like a fence post. "You'll help by not being seen," Mark replied. He guided them behind the curtain of mesh and poster board, where they could hear but not stare. Jade bristled, but Nina's calm presence made it hard to argue. The peak arrived without warning. Peanut lifted her head, then shifted her weight, and for the first time she didn't pause to scan the doorway. She pushed up, shoulders shaking, front legs braced. A faint rustle played at the far end of the hall, still soft, but present, and Peanut did not drop. Mark's throat tightened as she gathered herself higher. Then, impossibly, she rose to a full stand for a heartbeat, thin legs locked, body swaying, eyes wide with disbelief. Mark felt his own eyes burn, but he kept his back turned and his hands busy on the fence, as if this was nothing at all. Behind the screen, Tom sucked in a breath, and Mark heard Jade's nails scrape the wall as she stopped herself from reacting. Peanut stood for 2 full seconds, then 3, then sat back down carefully, not collapsing, not vanishing. The room stayed quiet, honoring the moment by not touching it. Nina whispered a single word to Mark. "Good." And nothing more. Eli kept folding towels like a man who didn't know a miracle had happened 10 feet away. And that was the point. After they cleared the visitors out, Mark walked the aisle alone as evening softened the light. Peanut lay resting, eyes half-lidded, but her gaze no longer looked trapped. Mark paused at the rail and let himself look at her fully for one breath, then looked away again, gentle as a promise. Tomorrow would bring pressure, but tonight had brought proof. Morning arrived like a test the whole center could feel in its bones. The fog burned off early, leaving the marsh bright and exposed, every sound sharper in the clear air. Mark woke before his alarm, dressed in the dark, and walked the nursery line with the steadiness of a man who knew one wrong move could undo a month of trust. Jade met him outside the office trailer, phone already in hand, hair pulled tight, eyes tired. "They're here by 10, she said, softer than usual. The edge in her voice was still there. But it wasn't only business now. It was fear of being responsible for failure. Mark didn't argue. He just told her the rules again, like reading out a safety checklist before a storm. By 9:30, two SUVs rolled in on the gravel with polished tires that didn't belong on wet ground. The donor, an older couple named Harold and Diane Mercer, stepped out carefully, smiles, practiced but sincere. With them came Tom Weller and a camera guy who looked eager to earn his paycheck. Mark watched the flash attachment on the camera and felt his stomach drop. He met them before they reached the nursery door and held up a hand. "No flash," he said, "not unkind, just absolute. No sudden movement, no crowding the pen. If you can't do that, we stop." Harold blinked, surprised. Diane's face softened, as if she'd been waiting for someone to protect the animal instead of the story. She nodded first. "We'll do it your way." Inside, the nursery had been transformed into quiet. Felt on hinges, rubber on latches, curtains hanging to block direct sight lines. Nina stood by the far wall with her small speaker turned down, ready but cautious. Eli moved like he belonged to the building, folding towels and wiping counters without ever glancing up. Mark placed the visitors behind the mesh curtain where their shapes would blur. Peanut lay on the mats, eyes open, reading the room the way she always did. The moment the visitors breathed too loud, her ear flicked. Mark felt every instinct in himself want to explain, to reassure, to soften. He did none of it. He turned his back and picked up a cordless drill like he was there to fix a hinge, not witness a miracle. Nina began with silence, letting Peanut settle into the new normal. Then, from the far end of the building, she played the gentlest rustle, barely audible, like dry grass in a light breeze. Peanut's trunk tightened for a second, and Mark saw the old fear rise like a shadow. Eli exhaled slowly, long and steady, as if the air itself could teach safety. Peanut lifted her head. One front leg shifted under her chest, then the other. She paused, eyes searching the edges of the curtain, searching for eyes. Mark kept his shoulders relaxed and his hands busy, forcing his body to broadcast indifference. Behind the mesh, Harold leaned forward a fraction, and Diane pressed 2 fingers to his arm, reminding him without words to stay still. The emotional peak came with a sound nobody expected. Outside, a gull cried, and a truck backfired on the road. Sharp, sudden, too real. Peanut's whole body jolted, and for a terrible second Mark thought she would drop back into that frozen, vanished place. He felt his chest tighten the way it did in burning buildings, when you realize you can't control everything. But Peanut didn't collapse. She trembled, held herself, and then, slowly, pushed. Her chest rose. Her front legs straightened. Her hindquarters gathered under her as if she was collecting courage from the ground itself. Mark's vision blurred with heat, and he bit down hard on the inside of his cheek to keep his face neutral, to keep his joy from becoming pressure. She stood, not for a heartbeat, but for long enough to be real. 5 seconds, then 10. Her legs wobbled, yet she stayed upright, ears fanning once, as if testing the air. The donor couple held their breath behind the curtain, and even Tom Weller looked stunned. The camera guy's finger hovered near the shutter, and Jade's eyes flashed a warning that could have cut steel. Peanut took 1 step, then another, small, careful steps that weren't for show, only for herself. Nina lowered the speaker to silence. Eli kept folding towels, as if walking elephants were an everyday inconvenience. Mark stayed turned away until Peanut chose to settle back down on her own terms, slow, controlled, like a calf who had decided she didn't need to disappear anymore. Afterwards, Mark finally faced the visitors. Harold's eyes were wet in a way he didn't bother hiding, and Diane reached for Mark's hand, as if she needed something solid. "I thought you'd saved her weeks ago," she whispered. Mark shook his head gently. "We saved her body," he said. "Today, she saved herself." When the SUVs left, Jade lingered by the nursery door, quieter than Mark had ever seen her. "I didn't understand," she admitted, voice small. "I thought standing was the goal." Mark looked, through the glass, at Peanut resting, calm, alive. "Safety was the goal," he answered. Jade nodded once, like a person being changed against her will. That evening, Nina asked what Mark planned to do with the black nylon and fishing line. Mark walked to the supply room and brought out a small, clear box. Inside, wrapped in felt, the scraps looked harmless, almost ridiculous. He placed the box on a high shelf where staff would see it every day, a reminder that disaster could hide in something the size of a hand. Eli stopped beside the shelf and stared at the box a long time. "That's how it is," he said softly. Not quite to Mark. "The thing that keeps you down is sometimes tiny, but it's right under you." Mark didn't answer right away. He just watched Eli breathe, watched the kid's shoulders loosen a little, and realized healing had happened in more than one body. Near dusk, Mark walked Peanut to the adjoining paddock, where an older, gentle cow named Magnolia waited, behind the fence line. Magnolia rumbled low, a sound like distant thunder, and Peanut answered with a smaller, braver rumble of her own. Mark stayed back, hands off, letting the elephants negotiate their own language without human punctuation. As the sky turned the marsh purple again, Peanut stepped forward and pressed her trunk against Magnolia's leg, testing trust the way calves do. Magnolia stood steady, patient, unhurried. Mark felt the tight knot in his chest finally ease, not into celebration, but into something softer, gratitude without noise. He leaned against the rail and let the quiet carry the ending. Later, when the nursery lights dimmed, Mark allowed himself one last look. Peanut was standing, not because she was forced, not because she was watched, but because the ground beneath her no longer whispered danger. The unthinkable truth wasn't just what Mark had seen under her. It was what it had been doing to her mind, and what it took from everyone to finally let her rise. If Peanut's story moved you, even a little, drop a comment right now. Type 1 if you believe healing is possible, even after the worst days. Or type 0 if you think some wounds never fully fade. I'll be reading every single one. And if you want more true, heart-pulling rescue stories like this, stories that remind us kindness still matters, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.